Welcome, everybody. Welcome as people come in tonight. This is my usual Friday thing. Um, kind of tired today. I got up not all that long ago, just several hours ago, and I had stayed up fairly late last night, proof listening to my latest story part that had come out. Hey, Grandma Deb, welcome. I was proof listening to my story last night as I released part 29 of the story and of the audiobook playlist for that. It turned out, for the most part, excellent, just like the part 28 before that did. There were some issues with part 27 towards the end, but all in all, you can still hear it if you're listening on a phone, if you have, really good volume options, or if you put the phone up to your ear, you can still hear how that ends. But, for the last 20 or so odd minutes. But the last two parts ended up, for the most part, turning out fantastic because there were very long parts, and I had prayed that nothing would go wrong with the volume or much else. There were some minor skippage with some of the audio in the last part, and I think maybe like one time in the part before that, but it wasn't anything that was too big of a deal where it, ruined the story. It still turned out great where you can understand it. Um, I am nearing the conclusion to the story, so there's only going to be really two parts left still to be read, which will be the part 30 and also the finale. So, what I'll do is I'll take a little short interlude, a little break between reading those parts, so that way I can, do a few more normal live streams like I'm doing tonight before I stop uploading content to YouTube, and basically beyond that, only really focus on the community tab. This is really my last project on YouTube, and once it's complete, there will be an entire library of vital information that is there and fully designed to help everybody to navigate foreign invasion and or internal conflict. So that will be there for everybody, which will be in the playlists predominantly, but also, of course, in the community tab where applicable. So welcome as everybody comes in. I was going to discuss a little bit of the Western Economic Forum this evening, and I was also going to discuss the proxy conflict and have a bit of an open forum after that. So hopefully, if everybody wants to talk and discuss different things, they can, air out any comments, concerns, questions, whatever, what have you, after I discuss what I planned on discussing tonight. So, basically, what is occurring now, starting the 16th here, is the Western Economic Forum, and they truly are a Western Economic Forum, not a World Economic Forum, as they do not control the whole world. They only control the Western world, as I have shown evidence, proof positive of multiple times over, and explained in great detail. There are two different sets of elites. And listen to this. Listen to this. Evidently, they are now requiring the services of roughly some 5,000 Western woke troops from Western European woke militaries to protect their stupid little meeting there. So that would only occur either due to some very credible intelligence of a real threat to them, or they are afraid, and legitimately so, from their rivals. When I say intelligence, I'm talking about something that could occur within Europe. in the western part of Europe. But when I say they're worried about their competitors, I'm talking about these eastern elites who could possibly either arrange for special teams, like tactical teams, to go in there and surgically handle their rivals, or another possibility would be to do something like send a few calibers or something of that equivalent sailing into their into their meeting place while they're there. Because if you think about it, they're all coming there and they're all going to be in one specific spot. And if their rivals of the Eastern elites really chose to do something about it right then and there, if they see no more need for business dealings with them in the future, that would definitely be the opportune time and place to deal some sort of a crippling blow to their rival Western organizations. So, be that as it is, there's definitely different options on the table for the Russians, the Chinese, the Belarusians, the Serbs, basically pretty much anybody that hates that group of people. Because they are, of course, hated by so many people, it's hard to tell who could be plotting what at what time, you know. I'm just stating obvious facts here. This isn't anything, you know, that's profound or anything. This is just the obvious. You know, it's just a gathering of different evil forces. So other evil forces might be out to get them if they feel the requirement to have 5,000 or so odd military troops protecting their meeting. You know, last time they had their own police force just for the event, and now they're upgrading that to military protection, which is kind of funny. But anyhow, you know, all that aside, they wouldn't be doing such things if they didn't feel that there was some kind of like credible threat and they had intelligence of some sort to their existence, or their well-being, whatever you want to call it, what have you, over there in Switzerland. So basically, oh, hey, everybody. Yeah, definitely unorthodox, yeah. Hey, B-Ran and C-Mac and I said hi to Grandma Deb and Unorthodox, and such a time as this. Good to see you, Brogan, and everybody. Welcome. So while these Western satanic elites are meeting over there to discuss their future dealings over the Western world, you very much have the Eastern elites of the BRICS Plus nations plotting their own, we'll just say, future plans for their own style of an NWO. As I've always maintained and I've always shown evidence of, well, here's something that plays a role in that, is that you have these Western elites now trying very hard to carry out criminal activities that will go against their rivals insofar as stealing more of their assets, which that'll create a domino effect. See, they have already stolen 300 billion of Russian state assets of the Russian regime, and I'm talking about these Western nations beneath these Western satanic banking elites. Well, what is going to happen here is if they actually do proceed further by stealing the assets of foreign corporations and foreign citizens, it'll create a domino effect that'll plunge the West into such a steep depression. It'll make what's happening right now look like the good old days by comparison, because you're going to have all these different foreign nations and their associated nationals, in quotes, and corporations and other such institutions rapidly pulling out all of their investments, all their capital, everything that they have put into what they thought were safe havens in the West are all going to be pulled out and away. And because our economy is basically at this point in time like near totally artificial and it's all based on usury and debt, for those investments to be withdrawn would send us plunging faster than we already are right now, currently as it stands. Because what's been going on, and I've covered it, and you all know I have, since 2020. I've covered it from the point that we've lost a third of our economy in GDP in real terms, all the way till recently when it was, in fact, reported. I think it was AEI.org, and there was some other sources I looked at where it said that officially we have shrunk, we have contorted by half of all our GDP, and it was some, what, 10 to 12 trillion, something like that. It was in that neighborhood. So we have shrunk officially by half. Half of our GDP and economy is gone in real terms, in real numbers. And everything else is just inflation, and not just inflation of the currency, but it's inflation of the statistics to make things look better than what they really are. Because again, they count credit and debt as GDP, which is insane. And I'm talking about in the West, they do. So we have this inflated, just this fake, bogus economic system that's on the verge of total collapse. There's countries around the world who are de-dollarizing because you now see what will eventually become the one world currency officially after World War III, which will be this BRICS plus reserve currency that they're already creating together. That will be your one world Eastern currency, because it'll be the East who prevails in World War III. And those are going to be the 10 Eastern kings of which Revelation speaks about, and they will be Eastern kings because in World War III, Babylon, which is USA, is going to be conquered and occupied and annihilated. And so will its allies, needless to say, because the whole collective West will be defeated. And everything right now, at this very moment, is setting up for that very thing to occur, to where you're going to have a exact situation precisely like what has been depicted throughout all my invasion work come into fruition. And it'll be just that easy. In a matter of days, they'll take this place over. Because we continue to not only send all our freaking ammunition into a proxy conflict, not to mention all that we've lost in the most recent two wars that this nation has prosecuted, one of which I was involved in. Then you also have how we wasted even more supplies, ammunition, and some weapons on trying to arm different sides in the Syrian civil conflict, as there was a whole multitude of different factions involved in that, and some of which we tried to intervene in. Every bit like what I depicted in my Second American Syrian-style conflict, where you had a few different factions getting weapons from the Russians and Chinese through third parties. That exact same thing is what occurred during the Syrian civil conflict, where you had major world powers supporting different factions in that conflict. Well, the West, being that its industries are depleted, it lacks the ability to rapidly replenish the ammunition and weapon systems that are just willy-nilly hawked off to these other conflicts, these proxy conflicts, these civil conflicts, what have you. You're going to have a situation where the West is not going to be adequately armed for any sort of high-intensity conflict. Again, because even before we started losing all of this vital equipment and ammunition that we badly need, we already had, as a whole collective bloc, and I'm talking about the whole collective West, I'm talking about NATO, including us, the USA, all in all, the collective West had a very limited capacity to wage a high-intensity conflict. And the capacity before we've just started to, send everything down the line. We had a limited capacity to wage perhaps a weeks to maybe 2 month long high intensity conflict before we ran out of everything. Whereas you've got Russia, and even more so now China, due to their ginormous industrial capacity. They're including their military industrial complex. Those two nations could wage a war, a high intensity one, for many, many, many years over. So now the West has taken its already limited capacity to wage any type of high intensity conflict because Western armies are primarily more geared into fighting tin pot dictatorships that really can't fight back worth a damn, or against counterinsurgency conflicts. We're not geared towards fighting other major powers. We are not at all geared towards doing that. And even less so because now, if you take everything that the West even had, with what's already been hawked off, given away, that has substantially decreased. 15 or more percent. And I'm saying 15% out of everything. When you take all of the West's air power, all of the West's sea power, all of the West's ground power, and you average it all out together, 15% of all of that is gone now, based upon all the land-based equipment and systems and logistics, supplies, everything, the fuel, all of it, ammo, all of that that's been given away. That takes a humongous chunk out of the already small capacity the West even had to begin with to wage any type of conflict, a high-intensity one. So, I said all that to say this. By the time that the time arrives to where there's going to be the Third World War, the West is going to be caught with its proverbial pants down when Russia and China, who's even more massive, deal the death blow to it. And after which is going to come your 10 victorious Eastern kings of Revelation. And these 10 kings, with their Eastern reserve currency, their new world currency, that will be your one world currency, your BRICS plus reserve currency. Okay? That's exactly what's going to happen. And even in the Word, in the Bible, you don't hear about the West anymore once Babylon's gone. You only hear about the East and the North, and the South too. The East and the North is China and Russia, predominantly. You could also lump Belarus in there with, and the other Commonwealth of Independent States nations that used to be part of the Soviet Union. You can lump really most of those in with the King of the North, and with the kings of the East, you can lump really like North Korea and some of the other allies like Pakistan. You can lump them all in with China. But China's predominantly the leader of the East, and Russia is the leader of the North, And sometimes even both can be used interchangeably, because when Babylon's destroyed, it talks about an alliance of nations coming from the north, which is across the North Pole. That's your China, that's your Russia, that's all of them. So that is how the West is going to be won. Like the old Wild West movies, how the West was won. Well, the West will be won for a second time by the East when they take it over, including Europe, Western Europe. So right now, as you're seeing all these, they technically these are small places on a map, but there is a lot of loss of life and equipment occurring there. These places like Bakhmut and Soledar, which is right outside of Bakhmut, which is surrounded right now itself, but it's also, Soledar is part of an even larger encirclement occurring around Bakhmut, which the proxy nation keeps continually feeding men and supplies into, which are all being slaughtered and destroyed, respectively, in terms of the men and the supplies, respectively speaking. So while all that is going on, I've always maintained I've always maintained, and you know I have, that everything that's going on in the east of that country there is nothing but the grand pinning maneuver of an even larger invasion, which we all know is coming because of that massive buildup that the Russians have been doing now for months. It's coming one of these days, soon too. It's coming. I don't know when they're going to exactly, pull the proverbial trigger on it all, but it's coming. It's going to be coming this winter. So it probably theoretically could have occurred already, but I guess because of people like Colonel McGregor, who I don't agree with every single solitary thing he says because he underestimates certain countries and their abilities, but and woefully so. But when it comes to what he knows about the whole situation and the proxy conflict, I'd say he's about right about most of it. But he is right when he described the freezing of the soils in the south closer to the Black Sea. He said it. He said, look, the soil in the north is already frozen near Belarus and Russia, but he said in the south near the Black Sea, he said it hasn't quite yet frozen all the way solid yet. And, so, okay, he is right about that. So if there is a contingent of the big invasion that's coming that has to come from the south, then that would be what they're waiting on. So, all in all, what that means is that once that occurs, whatever they're going to launch, if it's some sort of massive, envelopment, double envelopment, triple envelopment, whatever it is, because it would be a pincer sort of maneuver if they also have forces coming from the south alongside of those coming from the north. Whatever it is, in this broad sweep, they have to wait for the soil in the south to freeze. So I guess that's what the holdup is. But right now, what they're doing in the east of that country, holding up these large forces from this proxy country, is already fairly immense as it stands right now. I mean, just due to the sheer amount of life that's been lost in these places, especially on the proxy side of things, because they're the ones taking the losses, because it's already been mostly, for the most part, I'm not saying entirely, but for the most part, it has been largely an artillery and missile conflict. And when I say missiles, I, of course, also include the Kamikaze drones, too, that Russia has also been using. But they've also been using an immense amount of cruise missiles and also tactical ballistic missiles, too. Just all kinds of missiles. So that's another thing, too. China, interestingly enough, has been building immense quantities of highly capable kamikaze drones themselves. And the way they did it was they didn't even have to spend all that much money on it, because they had thousands of older aircraft, the J-6 aircraft, the old fighter jets that were styled off of the MiGs, the old fighter jets styled off of the Russian MiG-19s. They were called the J-6 fighters. Well, what they did was, because they had all of these old fighter jets left over, and these fighter jets can actually climb to a fairly high altitude, and they're fairly maneuverable, and they're small. So what they did to save money, so they didn't even have to really do a whole lot, was that they basically installed within these airframes all the necessary, I would say, control mechanisms that you would need to operate these things from the ground, so that whatever special warfare assets they have within the PLAAF, like their drone operator wings, can control these things. And they have the capability to launch immense amounts of these things at a single time. Like, I'm talking dozens of these things. So they can overwhelm Western radars and force them to turn on and reveal themselves in terms of air defense assets and other type of assets. When it comes to out in the Pacific, for instance, if you had a bunch of naval assets and they all had to turn on their equipment to track these things, they would reveal themselves so that China's vastly more high tech missiles and jets and ships would easily be able to find and destroy the Western ships. So, not only that, but you'd also have scores, entire scores, myriads of these kamikaze drones coming at you with whatever type of payloads they have on board. And in the past, these old fighter jets, yeah, they could carry a decent payload. They could, if it was all high explosive material, and you have a bunch of these things crashing into ships or whatever else, that just adds even more to all the capabilities they already had from their vastly newer, far superior, more modern equipment, that I've always discussed in the past. It was interesting to find out what that they've actually been doing with all these old jets they've got sitting around. And from the sounds of it, this massive kamikaze drone force that China's been building would be an enormous threat because if you think about all that you've already seen in the proxy conflict with the usage of even smaller ones that Russia's been using for strikes, imagine these even bigger jet-sized ones that have even more of a payload on them. They can cruise to higher altitudes. They're highly maneuverable because they're not really big fighter jets. These are like some of the small third generation fighters like that were nimble and specifically designed for dogfighting. They could still, traverse to fairly high altitudes, but they could also fly at lower altitudes. So these things could fly under radar. And if you have good enough drone operators controlling those things, they could do all kinds of horrible things with them. So, drones, especially kamikaze drones, are becoming ever more capable and popular in warfare. And my point of mentioning what China's been doing is what we've already seen Russia doing in the proxy conflict. So imagine you have hundreds, thousands of these types of things in a war. It would overwhelm basically anybody. So that China really wouldn't, they could save immensely on what they so choose to use their more advanced, more vastly more superior weapon systems on, because they can just use all these old ass cheap drones to sink a whole bunch of ships. I mean, that just by overwhelming them, in sheer numbers. I mean, it's a very serious threat. What drones have become lately. So I said that, and now I'm going to open it up into more of an open forum. I want to see what everybody's discussing here. Hello. How's everybody doing? Yeah, unorthodox. They did mention something like that in the past. I don't see them doing something like that. That's just too crazy. But they did mention that somewhere. I remember that from a few years back. You are right. Sorry, y'all. I gotta light a cigarette here. Anyhow, yeah, you are right, unorthodox. That was back in, I think, 2021, maybe even 2020 when they were talking about that. I can't remember where that came out. It came out in some news channel. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, Grandma Deb, our military is a joke now. It's all woke and depleted, hollowed out. I mean, really and truly, recently, our military has only been more of a counterinsurgency, styled force, and at very absolute most was designed to really, fight against tin pot dictators like Gaddafi or Saddam. I mean, we haven't fought a major power since Korean War and World War II before that. Back in World War II, Germany and Japan were big. They were big. They weren't like mamby-pamby, tiny tin pot dictatorships. These were major powers. And then after that, so was China. Because China is the sole reason why North and South Korea didn't unify under South Korea, because China came in and saved North Korea from being totally taken over by the Western powers, which were at the time called the United Nations. But the Chinese came in over the Yalu River and saved North Korea's bacon. They really did, because we weren't able to defeat China. We fought them to a stalemate. And it wasn't just us. It was us and a whole bunch of other countries all fighting China together, really. And China and whatever remained of of the North Koreans. And the North Korean army was basically vanquished by the point that the United Nations forces reached the North Korean Chinese border area. There wasn't really much left of the North Korean army at the time. So the Chinese basically single-handedly fought not only us, but our allies, the British, the Turks, because Turkey had a contingent there. I think the Australians and other Commonwealth, which they're called the Commonwealth back then, the other Commonwealth forces too. Basically just the collective West fighting China in the Korean conflict. So it was basically fought to a standstill. We weren't able to beat China, and China was basically held at bay on by near the 38th parallel. So it basically ended in a stalemate. So we really haven't fought a major power since Korea. And even the counterinsurgency wars that we fought against these little, insurgents type forces like Vietnam, when we fought the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army who came in to help them as things progressed. I mean, we didn't even beat them. We really didn't beat them. We didn't win that. We didn't really win in Iraq or Afghanistan either. We didn't. We lost. We tucked tail and ran. It didn't turn out good. And then, we defeated Saddam Hussein's, rabble called the Iraqi military. It was a joke by the time we fought them. And we knocked off Gaddafi, but we really didn't have any solid, hardcore solidified victories where you can be like, yeah, okay, we won, hands down decisively, because everything after Gaddafi and after Saddam, after Mullah Muhammad Omar in Afghan, it all just turned to absolute total shit. It was just a bad situation. So there really weren't any solid victories. So what I'm saying is, imagine now for a second with me, knowing what all we know about the history and about everything else that's going on now. Imagine now for a second with me that we do go up against these ginormous, these powers from the East, especially the world superpower, the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, China, with its 1.5 billion people, with its 40% of the entire world's industrial base, with the ability, and it's already doing so and showing us, that they produce most of the important metals and materials to build war material, and in terms of their equipment, the Chinese produce exclusively the most tungsten, steel, titanium, aluminum, zinc, chemicals. Everything you need for a war industry to function properly. They have the biggest military industrial complex on the face of the earth. In addition to having 40% of the whole world's industrial base anyway, then you have, the fact that their economy in real terms is the biggest economy on the face of the earth, bar none, hands down. They have the most robust, biggest technology sector. We go to them for our microchips and processors and other electronic components. We don't get them from Taiwan. We get it from the lowest bidder. We go to communist China. Yeah, communist China. That's who we get everything from. So they can get in and hijack our higher end equipment like they did with the F-35. And, I'm sure that's not the only time that's happened, because if it's happened other times, they're going to keep their mouth shut about it because it's that embarrassing. I mean, they also have this extremely potent electronic warfare arm. They've got the KG 600 jamming pods. They've got the same that are ground based. That they've already proven by almost making F-35s crash into the sea due to loss of control that their electronic warfare capabilities are every bit as good as what the Russians have. Who the Russians, for their part, have shut off our supposedly most advanced destroyer with, an Aegis class destroyer, the USS Donald Cook. That was the ship that not once in 2020 or in 2014, but twice also in 2021 in the beginning of the year got shut off due to the same means in the same exact place in the Black Sea. By exact place, I mean the Black Sea. It's happened 2 separate times to the same ship. And the crew members, they didn't re-enlist. Most of them didn't. Most of the crew didn't re-enlist because they saw how compromised of a position they were put into when an old school Russian ground attack aircraft, an Su-24 on one occasion and an Su-25 on another, both with those Kirkuk systems equipped, shut off. They have the Kabini. The Russians have the Kabini, the Kirkuk, and the Murmansk systems. And they shut off with the Kirkuk system the USS Donald Cook like a light switch. The Chinese, who had the ground-based electronic warfare systems out at Mumian Island, at their man-made reef base on Mumian Island, were the ones that almost made the F-35s crash into the ocean. So all of this stuff, that our enemies possess is light years ahead because of their means and methodologies that they possess, as well as the technical abilities to actually make it happen. They have the Chinese also have their Belt and Road, which is that gives them a real reach out and touch somebody capability, because their civil military fusion is what allows them, that civil military fusion policy I've told everybody out all about from way, way, way back when I, near the start of my channel, somewhat into my channel when I decided to make it a research-based information channel. That civil military fusion policy is what allows the Chinese to take anything and convert it to military usage, or even vice versa, but mostly that applies to methods of transportation. It applies to properties, like your Chinese Communist Party properties inside the United States, your CCP regime properties that are within our country. That is your civil military fusion policy. Those all become bases for logistics or units of troops. That the transportation becomes how they can transport their troops across the ocean with their humongous fleet of civilian vessels, be they ferries, be they cargo ships, be they, tankers, whatever. They can use all of it to transport their forces. They're not hurting for transportation. You see, that's the one thing that I disagree with Colonel McGregor on. He doesn't understand how enormous the Chinese fleet is, the civilian fleet that they possess, as well as their military fleet. The Chinese have the single biggest navy now on the face of the entire earth, and it's the most advanced navy, too, technologically speaking. They have some of the quietest, most deadly submarines, whether they're diesel-electric subs or whether they're nuclear-powered. They also, and it's the biggest subfleet to boot. They have way more advanced submarines than the French, who used a single submarine, the Sapphire, to sink, and it's an old sub, to sink an entire American carrier group. Imagine what the Chi-Coms can do with their subfleet. Then they also have the biggest surface fleet to boot, because they have the biggest single navies, sub and surface, all combined. They have, and it's the most advanced. It's a true blue water fleet. They went from a brown water, riverine, and littoral fleet, which is essentially like a Coast Guard style fleet, all the way from that 30 years ago to a true blue water navy that can deploy all around the world. Sure, they might keep things limited as of deployments, but they have their reasons for that because they have different bases already around the world. They've got Ream in Cambodia, they've got bases in Cuba, Venezuela. They can easily deploy in the Atlantic. They have bases in Africa. I'm talking about the Chinese. And that also includes anything that they have used as per the Belt and Road Initiative, like the modernized ports and everything. Those have a dual use. They can easily use those for military needs, including Colombo in Sri Lanka, which, as I told everybody that the Chicoms would once again wrest control over Sri Lanka, and they have, because one of the first things after all that turmoil and civil unrest occurs, they sent their naval vessels in there to deploy whatever type of intelligence personnel they used, or military personnel in disguise they used, to install another CCP friendly regime in Colombo, and they sure did that. I told everybody they would, and they did. So you have China making inroads, as well as Russia in the Middle East. You got Saudi leaning ever closer to completely joining, along with the other BRICS nations, or the OPEC nations rather, the BRICS Plus. They're all going to align with BRICS Plus, which will cut off our oil supply because our domestic oil production is already lacking severely because it's all been neglected or shut down deliberately, and it's not something that you can just get back up and working lickety split. It doesn't work like that. So the moment you have these foreign sources of fuel being cut off, if it happens all at one time, or at least enough of them do at one time, it's going to basically cripple us. It will cripple us. And the amount of fuel our military requires is astronomical, even for the small military we have when you compare it to, like, other nations like, China or even Russia, who's bigger than our military. They have a bigger military than ours, and I'm talking everything: reserves, active, paramilitary. Our fuel consumption is so astronomical because our military has bases throughout the world, and we also have a lot of gas guzzling military vehicles that are not anywhere at fuel efficient whatsoever, because our tanks use turbine engines that consume fuel at a crazy rate. And you have the Russians and Chinese using diesel engines, which are more fuel efficient. Just little things like that make a difference. And you have, again, our forces with these crazy numbers of bases in places where we really shouldn't even have bases, because it really doesn't make any sense from a military standpoint. But, you have to use fuel to transport all your forces. And our Air Force is the biggest single branch that consumes fuel in our entire military, because, of course, we have this humongous Air Mobility Command, which is what we predominantly use to fly our forces and some of their equipment throughout the world to all these far-flung bases we have. Whereas you have China and Russia, who have simplified things, and they only put their installations, including the ones China would use for Belt and Road, they only put those where they feel it's absolutely necessary to put them, where it makes the most sense. And because, remember, they're frugal and austere in their thinking, these Eastern elites and their subordinates. They're frugal in their thinking. They don't want to use more than they know they need to do anything. So they do things that are cost effective, and they're very long-term deliberate planners, whereas the West is more like, just haphazard, and they just run out and just do stuff. It's just they do stuff without even thinking, it seems. Maybe they did have a thought behind it, but it never pans out well, because things go wrong, it seems, all the time. Look at all the failed counterinsurgency conflicts, like I mentioned earlier. Look at all the failures. Just go through history. It's all so revealing. It's all very revealing. But let me see what everybody's saying here. But you're going to have a situation where my story comes to pass quite easily, too easily. Yeah, Shadow Mask, not very much, really. Really and truly, not very much. You have to understand the quote unquote world economy is really split in two right now. It's bifurcated. You have the East with their own economic system, and you have the West with their own system, and it's really just bifurcated. It would affect the West, but it wouldn't really affect the world because there's other parts of the world besides the West, and they're not really affected by it because they continue to trade with Russia, China, and other nations. India. I mean, all these other big nations. They're still trading amongst themselves. They don't need the West like the West needs them because through globalism, the West really stabbed itself in its own foot. I mean, because with globalism is when you saw all the vital trade secrets, the economic, financial, military, all these vital secrets of success and everything that the West once had were all taken by the likes of China and whatever other nations had the means to obtain such things, and they developed with it their own indigenous capabilities to where they no longer need the West. They don't need the West anymore. They already have everything they need. They built themselves up, and as a result, they have their own indigenous, which is their own homegrown sources of everything, of technology, of industry, of everything. They don't need us anymore. They really don't. So when the West is cut off from its fuel sources, it won't be able to prosecute any type of war because those vehicles won't go anywhere without fuel. Nor will they be able to have much of a war industry, if any at all, because we already lack the industry of war production. But not only that, without fuel, you're not going to be able to get components to different factories, nor will you be able to get any finished products that just came off the assembly lines to where they have to go. You're just going to, nothing will happen. Everything will come to a standstill. That's exactly what will happen. Everything in the West will come to a standstill. It'll all be for naught. It's all going to collapse. So when you have the West, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this, trying to steal assets from these other nations, it's going to backfire immensely. It'll make our economy fall so quick. It'll be like it'll be like 10 times worse than a USSR style collapse. It'll be pretty bad. It'll happen fairly rapidly in a matter of days. It'll seem like it's overnight, but it'll occur in a matter of days. It'll just be one thing after another at that point. It'll be like dominoes. You'll see all these big occurrences that'll all seemingly come together to make this ginormous disaster of epic proportions that it just is beyond all description. It's beyond what words will be able to articulate. Because, as the saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And the West has, all these bubbles, all these, economic bubbles, these debt bubbles. Everything is a bubble, and they'll all pop. They'll all pop near around the same time, and it'll be such an epic catastrophe. There won't be any words for it. It'll all intertwine to make this ginormous disaster. Everything will. They own their own blocks, Shadow Mask. China has its own elites because they control their own issuance of currency. Same with the West. See, the West has their elites as these satanic banking elites, whereas in the East, the regimes themselves are the elites because they control their own central banks. You don't have bankers over them. The governments are over the banks. The regimes control the banks, the central banks, and the currency issuance. See, the elites are they who control the currency issuance within their own spheres of influence. China has its own elites. The CCP are their own elites. They are their, Xi Jinping is their little god man for life. He's their emperor for life, and he controls everything in China because he controls the central banks, he controls the military, he controls the whole Politburo, he controls the CCP. Who controls basically everything in China. Yeah, I mean, they've done business with the West, but they're not, that doesn't mean that they're on the same footing. Same with Russia. Russia has their own elites because they control their own central banks and their issuance of their currency in Russia. It's even a law in Russia that the central bank has to give the Russian regime half of all their profits. You would never see anything like that in the West because in the West, the central banks loan money to the regimes with crazy interest rates, who the taxpayer has to pick up the tab for. But in Russia, things are way different because you have the bank by law being forced to fork over money to the Russian regime. You would never see anything like that in the West, because in the West, the money's loaned to the regimes. It's not given, But whereas in Russia, they control the bank. Same with China and India and North Korea and Iran and Pakistan. They all control their central banks. It's way different over there than it is in the West. It's way different sets of elites as a result of such. It's hard for people to fathom, but it's not a cut and dry thing like a lot of people think. There's not one set of elites. There's different elites, and they're all jockeying and competing for power. Because if they were all on the same footing, we'd have been under some sort of a one world system way long ago, very drastically long ago. There's different elites. But see what else everybody's saying. Yeah, hey, Just Man, great to see you. I hadn't seen you in a little bit. Good, glad you came in. Yeah, the Chinese and Russians are going to do exactly what I've shown people in my hypotheticals. They're going to come in here and they're going to crush this place. They're even going to take the Western elites back to China or maybe Russia too, respectively, and humiliate them because they're their rivals, When the power block of the Western elites is gone, they will have no more chips on the table. How are they going to control anything? They won't have any more security forces, meaning militaries or police to enforce their will. They won't have any more money because China and Russia can just take their money and make them slaves anyway. They're not going to be able to escape when the West is destroyed. It's how will they control anything? The West, how will the Western Economic Forum be a shot caller when China has taken over their whole source of their power, their whole power block, China could just take everything they want at that point. It won't even, there's nothing, they'll have no say in it, It's sort of like the camp inmates in my latest story part. They have no say in what happens to them at that point. What are they going to, how can they, make any calls when they're the ones that are imprisoned? It'll be the same case with these Western elites once the Chinese and Russians take over the West. How will they be able to make any decisions when they're going to be at the complete and total mercy of the CCP and the Russian political oligarchy and their associated Eastern allies? They won't be able to make any decisions at that point. They won't have any more power because they won't have any more chips on the proverbial table with which they can bargain or make decisions and force those decisions with. Anything at that point on their part will be complete delusion and fantasy because they won't have any way to enforce their power anywhere. If China and Russia take everything over, which they will, and they'll be the 10 kings. There'll be two of the 10 kings. There'll be two of the chiefest among the 10 kings because they're going to be the two that have the most power. But there's also going to be 8 other ones of the 10, and those are going to be your real shot callers that end up with all the power in the end times, like it says in Revelation. They're going to be the ones who give their power to the beast, who will be the one world ruler for a very short time along with them, because it says they reign together with the beast, which means they have all the real power, because after World War III, they're going to be victorious. They're going to have these massive armies and industrial might and their financial and economic might. All of it will be combined of these 10 victorious kings. And they give all their real power to the beast, who is a swindler and a con man and a hustler who convinces them to do so, because he doesn't have any real power of his own other than what Satan gives him to be a con man. So he has to get his power from the 10 kings, like it talks about in Revelation. He comes from obscurity, like it talks about in other books of the Bible, like meaning he comes from nowhere. Like nobody, not very many people recognize the beast. A lot of people have their own assumptions on who they think it'll be, but nobody really knows who the beast is. Nobody knows. People can assume things. Some people think it's an American president, but that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that the beast comes out of the old Roman Empire. And Portions of the old Roman Empire even stretched into Russia along the Black Sea, also the proxy country that's right now having a conflict within its borders. I mean, there were Roman trade cities that were on the Russian Black Sea coast. Yes, there were. There were also some in Crimea. The old Roman Empire at its height even stretched into Iraq and down the Levant. It was all throughout the Mediterranean, even into the Black Sea. I mean, there were a lot of different countries that the old Roman Empire encompassed. That are on the modern day map. That is. So the man of sin, the beast, he comes out of one of those areas. He's not an American. So people think it's some kind of American president. No. And presidents are low on the totem pole of power when you really look at how the Western elites, control things. The Western elites are these big bankers, and some of them you've never even heard of before. You've never even heard their names. And, because they're so shadowy, they don't want to be known about. And, the politicians are pretty low on the totem pole when it comes to the West. Things are different in the East, like I mentioned many times. I mean, in the East, you have the leaders there in those regimes controlling the banks, so it's a bit different. But in the West, you have the bankers. See, the roles are reversed. You have the bankers controlling the politicians. So people think it's some president. No, it's not. It's not going to be a Babylonian. I mean, an American. It's not going to be that. It's going to be someone who came from the old world out of the old Roman Empire. So I don't think anybody really knows who the beast really is. Nobody really knows. But everybody will find out eventually, because everybody's going to see who it'll be, because at some point they're going to make themselves known. And I believe that point to be after World War III, after the Eastern nations have their great victory and the world becomes unified, because the war will be so horrific, especially in the West, that the rest of the world will be like, oh man, we don't need to have any more wars. We need to unite behind a one world leader who can, unite the world together so we don't have any more horrific wars. But it'll be an Eastern-oriented NWO, because it's going to be the elites of the East who build it. These 10 kings, who give their power unto the beast. So we have to go by what the word says. And the word talks about these 10 kings. It mentions a third world war, like the War of Ezekiel is a strong contender for that. And it talks about these Eastern kings and that. I mean, they're mentioned throughout. They're mentioned in Jeremiah. I mean, these Eastern kings are going to be your BRICS plus major nations that play a role in that. So those are going to be the victorious 10 kings who lead in Revelation alongside of the man of sin, who they'll all agree to give their power to. And that'll be after Mystery Babylon USA and their Western allies are soundly crushed and defeated in a third world war. It'll be every bit like I've shown and depicted throughout all my invasion work. It'll be just like that. It'll be every bit like that. Every bit like that. Probably even worse. In some ways, at least. But, see what everybody's saying. Said I'd do a bit of an open sort of forum. Oh yeah, definitely, Shadow Mask. People get hung up on the small, dumb stuff, and they think that these like little distractions are like meaningful in some kind of way, and they look at it for all this symbology and meaning, and really doesn't have to mean anything. It's just a way to get people to chase their tails, while bigger things are afoot. Definitely right, Shadow Mask. I agree with you there. Lots of distractions. Yep. Yeah, exactly, B-Ran. You know what I'm talking about. That stuff, the transportation, just alone, the transportation required to get to all those far-flung places where our relatively small military has garrisons and, FOBs and bases. It's an insane quantity of fuel. And if we get cut off from fuel sources, the fuel situation will become so dire. All of those far-flung garrisons we have throughout the world, with our tiny military being so spread out, they'll all be cut off and wiped out piecemeal, bit by bit, in a war. It'll be that easy. Because if they have no fuel, what are they going to do? They can't do anything. Exactly. Yep. Well, I guess that's everybody. Yeah, thank you, Brogan. Yeah, if everybody could help me out by hitting that thumb up so I can get this pushed out. This was a pretty good show tonight. It went for an hour, so that's pretty good. Covered a lot in an hour. But yeah, if people haven't, be sure to listen to the whole audiobook. The days, which are just the invasion. I really only covered the days of the invasion, days 1 through 4, throughout the audiobook. Essentially, so far, it's about a day and a half in length, and I'm talking about the entire audiobook. It's almost 36 hours in length, which means that if you listen to it straight through, I cover the events of 4 days of the invasion within a day and a half. Like a literal day and a half is what it takes to listen to that whole thing, because it's 36 hours long in length, roughly. By the time it's done, it'll be longer than that. So in a day and a half, roughly, I will have covered 4 days of the invasion phase before it goes into the occupation, which ends up being a long, drawn-out, like utterly horrific war of occupation and extermination, and on the part of the Chi-Coms and their buddies trying to ferret out the partisans and wipe them out and enslave the people and organ harvest them in their death camps and things like that. I mean, it's so just within the first 4 days, which is the invasion itself, the 96-hour long invasion, with the audiobook, I cover 4 days worth of events in a literal day and a half. It took me a literal day and a half within the entire length of the whole audiobook to cover the events of 4 days, which is crazy because that's an insanely long story. Just for an audiobook, that is an insanely long story. It took me months to do that. These audiobooks aren't, these portions, these parts of the audiobook are not easy at all to do. I mean, I have to write them, then I have to edit them as carefully as I can, because the editing process is tedious. Then I got to get up there and read it, which takes hours. I mean, just for each and every part, a lot of work goes into it. A lot goes into the character development, bringing up situations from previous parts that happened and tying them into newer parts. I mean, it takes a lot to do all that. So it's a hell of a well put together story. I mean, for all the work that's gone into it, all the time, all the effort. I mean, it's a lot to do these. But by the time it's all finished and concluded, even as my last project, it'll definitely be probably the most labor intensive, yet one of the best projects I think that I will have ever done on this channel. The only thing that I think would come really close to it, again, would be that civil conflict thing. I know I say it a lot, but that was done really well just because I could actually listen to that one over and over because of how well the everything came together in that. Now, like there were character development aspects with the leadership of the different factions. Then you had the economic, the financial, the systems that developed. You had the armies on the field of battle. You had the battle maps even, which showed how they operated in the larger battles. You had the foreign intervention aspects. You had the fact that all the factions came from real life research of things that are actually already occurring even before most of it happened. And I've explained all that before. You also have the fact that not only that, I go into depth with how the atrocities happened, the foreign intervention, even a special operations mission was mentioned. I mean, just so many different things in one series. That is why I love that one so much, and I can actually listen to that one over and over because of how much I really enjoyed that, how it came together. But the audiobook, wow. I mean, just out of all the invasion work, that one It's even better than the typed out stories just because of how detailed and how long it managed to become. I mean, if you really want to have a full understanding, I mean, not that the typed out stories weren't good, but it's that, they're long. People don't like to read. I get that, but they do go into the occupation phase a bit. But the audiobook is strictly just the invasion phase, which is the first 4 days. And you really got to see how things developed, and you got to see it in great detail. So that one was just wow. I mean, it did. It turned out pretty damn good. I'm happy with it. I'm definitely happy with it. But it's very long, very long. So if you listen to it from beginning to end, you're probably going to spend some days listening to the whole thing. But it shows you everything step by step, how that type of situation develops in great, extensive detail. Extensive, immense detail. It shows how those types of situations develop. And that'll teach you a lot about how to navigate something like that. Not that my community tab story review didn't, which is in its own playlist. Not that the others didn't. The other work, like the battle maps, to show how the units move on an overhead view on a map. But the audiobook is like nitty gritty, down to the street level, character level point of view, where you're actually seeing what it looks like on the ground as it unfolds. I mean, just wow. I mean, it was really intensive. I mean, it was very detailed. But it'll be done after a few more parts. I got part 30 and then the finale part, which will basically like explain what happens right after the invasion with the different characters who survived the invasion, but not all of them will survive the occupation, but it goes into some of that. But I'll get there. I'm going to, do an interlude, a little break before I get back on those last two parts. So I can do some normal live streams here and there. But after that, I'll do a long, finale stream for myself, my farewell on YouTube, where after that, I'm not uploading any more content. The most I'll do maybe is just community tab stuff, but that'll be it. After that, this is my last project. But I'm a man of my word. I definitely kept my word. I said I would see it through to the end, and here we are. We're getting close to the end of it, very close. So I want to thank each and everybody for coming. I appreciate everybody. I really, truly do. I thank each and every one of you for coming. It shows me that a lot of people really are serious about their learning and broadening their horizons in different ways, and I can definitely appreciate that, and I do. So, you all have a blessed night. Thank you all for coming, everybody.